Okay. Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to the latest episode of the Red Pilled Fiction Factory. Live, well, recorded here in the Yucatan Peninsula where it's another scorching day. Unusually, this episode is going to be featuring me as the guest, and this is all thanks to Corporate Clark, who I interviewed a few months ago regarding his novella House Anon. And he's kindly offered to be the host today, and we're going to be talking about my book, Lost Causes. So over to you, Clark. Thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you so much for taking the intro, because that was the bit I'd been rehearsing in my head so much. Because the podcast name is a bit of a mouthful, and I knew I was going to mess it up. But yes, Richard, you are the author of Lost Causes. So first of all, let's have a little bit of an introduction about yourself. Where are you from? What's your background? How did you get where you are?
Right. Now I know what it feels like for all my poor guests that I've had on the show. I was born in late December back in '63, like the song, the famous pop song, in Jamaica of all places. My dad had been sent out there. He came from a humble background in Yorkshire, started working for Woolworths as it was, and they sent him out to Jamaica, where he stayed over a decade, and met my mother out there, and I was born. And it was an interesting, now I reflect on it, it was an interesting period of time. Kennedy had just been shot a month to the day, more or less, before I'd been born. Jamaica was just independent for the first time, because Britain was retreating from the empire. And I was in the tail end of the baby boom. It's literally, by some calculations, the last week of the baby boom. So I see it as a sort of turning point in world history, not thanks to my birth or anything, but yes, I do think that it was a pivotal moment, and it's one obviously since then I've been following closely world events, and I think those trajectories have sort of continued. The death of Kennedy was never resolved, and it still haunts us in many physical and literal ways. The empire obviously collapsed shortly afterwards completely and is gone, and Britain is still looking for its roots, and the baby boomers basically took over and done what they've done to what's left of civilization. I came to England very shortly afterwards. I was only 3 or 4 when I got to England, but it's interesting. I always saw myself as an outsider somehow. I always saw myself, ironically, well, weirdly, as a Jamaican, even though I was more British than anything, and I'd only lived there for a little while. But I think that gave me an interesting insight into the mechanics of Britain, and I looked at it as an observer rather than as a participant for a long time, and maybe still do to this day. So I think that played an important part. Went to school in North London, a place called Merchant Taylors, and went on to university at Edinburgh, where I chose to do philosophy and psychology. At that point, decided I wanted to be a writer of sorts at some point. I had no specific goals. And I thought that a good base foundation for that art is philosophy and psychology, because everything ultimately can be reduced back to one or the other. But it turned out I found it a complete waste of time. I think the institution of the university, the British University, had already past its peak long before I went there, and this was in the early 80s. And I found it a complete waste of time, and I felt very frustrated. So to an extent, I felt frustrated because I felt what university was actually doing, it was not doing a lot of things. It wasn't educating me, it wasn't improving me, but it was sapping my energies and my drive and my ambition, which when you're at that age, 20, you should be full of energy and full of drive and full of, there should be no limits. And there you are, basically getting drunk and skipping class, and it's sort of the opposite direction you want to be going. So, and it reached a peak one day, and I just said, I'm out. So I started a business with my mother, very small family in the kitchen, basically making Mexican food. My mother's Mexican, and it amazingly grew from nothing to quite a significant size. I did that for 5 years. It was very hard work, very industrial, in a factory in Aylesbury and Buckinghamshire the whole time. Satisfying, but not well, satisfying in the sense that I was achieving something and I was challenged every day, because I have no idea how to make a tortilla, let alone run a Mexican food business, and nor did she. But I didn't find it fulfilling in other ways. I was very isolated and very sort of working like a martyr to this machine that made the tortillas. And then I decided to give it a break, and soon after that got picked up by a Mexican beer brand, Corona Extra, which had never been in the UK before, and they took me on as their British and European representative. So I had a good run with them. It didn't last too long because of Mexican politics and business practices and all sorts. But it was financially rewarding, and this is the important part, and this is why I get to this point. It gave me the financial stability and foundation to say, I was just 30 by then, right, I want to write, I've got some money, I've got no responsibilities, I'm going to try to write a book. So that's where Lost Causes started.
And it's funny you should say about Corona, because we are actually sponsored today by Corona. I'm joking.
About that.
We can't get sponsorship from anywhere. No. But that's interesting, your perspective as an outsider, though, because let's talk about the book Lost Causes now, which I thought was fantastic. And as I said in my little write-up, it's a rip-roaring ride of a thriller, magnificently exciting. And I mean, obviously I enjoy reading a lot of books, but in terms of just pure enjoyment, page turner, I haven't felt like this since I read maybe Jurassic Park.
Wow.
Fantastic page turner, just pure entertainment. Can't recommend it highly enough. But the main character, John Buchan, is that how it's pronounced?
Buchan. It's pronounced
John
Buchan.
Sorry.
Yep.
John Buchan is also an outsider in that he's from Rhodesia originally.
Correct. Yes.
And did that inform the character, your own experiences,
Yes.
in sort of the outsider view of Britain?
Yes. I deliberately chose somebody who's an ex-colonial. I mean, Jamaica is not one of the great colonies that everyone thinks of, but it was it was a colony. And I grew up, a lot of my young friends when I was young had that sort of rugged individualism that comes with living out in the bush in the middle of, the tropics, which I liked. And you see it a lot in South Africans and Australians, well, in the old days. I won't say it's so true anymore, but certainly in the period I was writing, I like the rugged individualism that they showed, but also it gave me an opportunity to show how he viewed the UK, because Rhodesia, obviously, history is a little bit different to Jamaica's, but they fought for us valiantly in 2 world wars, and then they were trashed by us very shortly after the Second World War. And it allowed me to explore the dynamics of Britain's treatment of its, those that had helped it, and its betrayal of some very good people.
Because he's someone who loves Britain, but is also apart from it, so can see its faults.
Yes.
A very interesting perspective to take.
Yeah, it's very much my perspective. I'm an ardent patriot, love my country dearly. It breaks my heart to see it going the way it's going. It's something I've watched closely because I picked it up in about mid-90s. I realised what was coming, and but yes, love it and hate it in equal measure in a way. But I'm optimistic for its long-term future, but not so much its short-term future.
Yeah. So this is the Red-Pilled Fiction Factory. So what do you consider being red-pilled? Do you consider yourself red-pilled, and how or when did you become red-pilled?
Right. I deliberitely chose the term red-pilled as opposed to there's other. Dissident right is a term that's used, sometimes spelled W-R-I-T-E. Things like that, which are clever and useful. But it's not so much a right-wing thing. I wanted to allow for the fact that there are many people of the left on our side. There are many people who are neutral on our side. There are many people who don't know where they stand, but all have something in common, which is that they've really seen through the smoke and mirrors that we're being treated to daily, and have understood that there's we're living in a world gone wrong. Raymond Chandler used that phrase a lot. A world gone wrong, and no one seems to be addressing the issue with any seriousness. And when they do address it, they just make things worse. They're not getting to the root cause, and that it's more about theatrics and virtue signaling and trying to look good in everyone else's eyes. So Red Pilled allows for anybody of any persuasion, really, who is just thoroughly fed up with the way things are going and understands that something's very wrong. They don't necessarily need to have the solutions, but they're definitely like-minded as to the symptoms and to the symptoms, let's say.
Yeah. And I think we should remind viewers and listeners that where the term red pilled got popularized, and because a lot of it's almost used as a slur now, unfortunately, but it comes from a documentary that was made in 1999 called The Matrix. And
clever.
No, it comes from the Matrix, the science fiction action movie The Matrix, where the main character Neo, all humans worldwide are locked into, basically they're living in a virtual reality which is becoming frighteningly conceivable now, but they're living in a virtual reality, and in the real world these robots are like living off their life energy. And so to leave the Matrix and to see the real world, Neo gets offered a red pill or a blue pill, and if he takes the red pill, it sort of ejects him from the Matrix and you can see the real world. So yeah, the context is that it was a term where people said, I'm seeing beyond the narrative and I'm seeing the reality. So just perhaps to explain it to our younger viewers. And I agree with you to a large extent that there are people on our side who and it gets called right-wing or alt-right, but there are so many people, like I said in my own interview, there's people like Ricky Gervais, there's people like, the other comedian.
Pat Condell is a good example, and he was big on YouTube a long time ago, but probably banned now. But there were sort of old-fashioned lefties who believe in freedom of speech, civil rights,
Shockingly, even someone like Jermaine Greer is being kind of dismissed by the left now, which is astonishing. Yeah. Absolutely astonishing, yeah. It is. But just moving on from that a little bit, I thought the politics was almost secondary in Lost Causes. It's there, and there's a lot of political things happening. But when I got to the end of the book, or rather when I got to kind of the villain's big speech, the classic kind of spy thriller where the villain makes his big speech explaining his plan at the crescendo of the action, I realized that for you, the sort of politics is downstream from like culture or attitude. I don't know if you wanted to open up that.
Yeah, I'd love to. I think when I set out to write the book, there were several major themes I wanted to address, because I felt, it wasn't really worth me writing a book unless I was going to address them. I knew I was going to end up dedicating enormous amounts of time and resources to this thing, and to come out at the other end without, it was therapy in a way. I needed to download the sort of traumas that were going on in my head into physical form on the page. And one of the things I learned very early, I was about 30, I time and space on my hands, and I wanted to write a book. So I started inhaling in industrial quantities the news and studying in detail what was going on around me, much more so than most people would. because they've simply got jobs or families or something. And it became very clear to me that the politics was really just a window dressing at some point early on. Something much more sinister was going on, if you like, something much more subtle, hidden. Maybe it came from my few years at university studying psychology. One of the first conclusions I came to studying psychology was we know sweet FA about the human mind and what goes on in it. So we can pretend we understand it, and we can predict within some degree of accuracy the way people will behave. But it's not a science by any means. And the simple fact is that you can have a Yorkshire Ripper being interviewed 20 times by the police. I don't know if that's actually the case, but a mass murderer being interviewed 20 times by the police. They know they've got everything on him that they need except a sort of confession, and they can't get it.
As long as we say allegedly,
yeah,
interviewed 20 times by the police. I think we're okay.
Or one of those. It's a simple fact of life. We have psychopaths among us who, and I won't say allegedly to that, we do have psychopaths among us, and they get away with it because they're pretty good at covering their tracks and not letting the secret out. And I think if we don't get to that understanding quickly, we are just baffled and bewildered by the mass of headlines, and this party says this and that party says that, and so on, and you get kind of lost in the minutiae. You don't see the forest for the trees. And to me, it became clear that there were basically a lot of people amongst us, many of them were friends, many of them trusted colleagues, whatever, who had a completely different view of the world and how it should be to mine. And the breakthrough, this several breakthroughs probably, but one very simple one, which I now advocate to anyone, I was stuck in the middle of Mexico writing a travel guide in a town that's famous for its left-wing sympathies. It's got sort of minor terrorist organization bases itself there. It's called Chiapas is the state. And I was on a business trip effectively, but surrounded by lefties one night in the bar, and I knew I couldn't reveal anything. So I played along, and I sort of pretended to be a left-wing sympathizer. That I'd come to this town to like a lot of people, Germans, French, everyone, they come to this town as a sort of mecca. And I went along with it, and blimey. But now you have to be quite convincing. You have to have a few drinks. You have to let them know in no uncertain terms you're on their side. But once you do, they start telling you the truth. They start telling you how it really is. And all it is about hate and spite and envy and destruction. And it's nothing pretty. There's nothing about striving for equality or the dignity of the all men and all that. That is just window dressing. So you get very quickly to the core. And I since did it on a couple of other occasions. Same thing, and I always got the same results. So that gave me a sort of milestone I could use to further my research, which I did. And I started looking at what people do rather than what they say in public, and what they say in private rather than what they say in public. And you put it all together, and you get a very clear picture that this is, and you occasionally, I have to say, get it in news stories today. You might, you'll see it occasionally, a politician, or a left-wing politician, or whatever it is, or even a right-wing one, will say the truth about what they really feel. They won't, they'll cover it up and say it was out of context later, or maybe you'll have to be sharp to pick it up. But it's there, and I'll tell you two good sources for this. One is the Ted Kaczynski's Unabomber manifesto, where he very honestly speaks on behalf of the left, and it describes exactly the mentality, and I highly recommend that to anyone. Not that I admire the man particularly, but he could bloody get to the core. And there's another strange correlation to that is the Columbine Massacre Children's Manifesto, which also expresses these thoughts of it all comes down to a kind of inadequacy and inferiority complex. And they can't better themselves, or don't want to, or can't be bothered, or whatever. So the only other way you can bring yourself to everyone else's level, if you can't go upwards, is to bring everyone down. And that's what we're living in a world run by people who seek our diminishment, nothing else.
I think there were a couple of less dramatic examples. Was when that time Gordon Brown was on the election circuit, and he was like pounding the pavements, meeting people, and that just regular kind of 50-something-year-old woman just expressed some concern about immigration, and he still had his mic on in the car, and he was calling her a bigot, etc., etc. And then a few years later, Emily Thornberry did the same. She took a picture of a house in England with the St. George's flag outside. In England, and said something. I can't remember exactly what she said, but it was something to the effect of, "Oh, look at these horrible people."
Yeah, and you get it in America. There's been the bitter clingers. Clinton and Obama have all had hot mic moments. Biden's done it quite a lot, and even yesterday, I think some American politician was saying, "Screw the suburbs." It's basically white people or something in the suburbs. We hate them. But yeah, it comes out every now and then, but we don't take it seriously enough. When they're telling you what they're doing, take it seriously. Yeah,
when the mask slips, we are too generous sometimes. But just to summarize that, there was one particular line that I read that just summarized that whole thing of how you saw. It's what, and I've struggled to find a better term for it, but it's what Ayn Rand would call like a sense of life, just that outlook on life, and seeing things differently. And what the line was, this particular line stood out for me when you said she was just another casualty of the low-intensity war called peace. Another statistic for the record books. Just that phrase, the low-intensity war called peace, just summed up for me like how everything in the book was not explicitly political, but just seeing things through a slightly different perspective, not acknowledging the narrative that peace is just a ceasefire, not.
Well, I do think there's a very strong. Some things came to me in the course of the writing, and one of them was that really a lot of what we call politics is much more biological than we allow. I'm not saying it's entirely genetic or anything, but biology and even to a very large extent the availability of resources, which is a kind of sub-niche area we don't have to go into in too much detail, but we are animals at the end of the day, and animals know no peace. I live in a village in Mexico. The dogs, they're out there either trying to shag another dog to perpetuate their gene pool, or they're trying to fight a dog to stop him from perpetuating their gene pool. It doesn't matter if it's in a village in Mexico with dogs, but apply it to ants, apply it to giraffes and lions. Wherever you look, the world is a constant. Heinlein was very good on this. Robert Heinlein, the world's a battlefield. We are just very privileged to have grown up, and this is why I bring back the boomer era. From the 60s onwards, we've lived in a massive period of unprecedented peace and tranquility and prosperity, which has divorced us completely from any thoughts of that we're in a kind of competition to survive. But you can only have holidays from reality for so long. Before long, nature comes back with vengeance, and you're fighting for your life again, which is what really I think the period we're coming back to now.
So let's move into the book itself and the style of the book, because there's a lot to say here. Like I said, it's a very exciting, very well written book. When did you start to think you might write a book? How long did it take you to write it? And like, is there any kind of publishing history behind it? Because a lot of it feels quite prophetic, and a lot of it feels like it's kind of already come true.
Yeah, I was a big fan of Ayn Rand in my teens. I now see her in a different light, and I see excellent aspects to her work, outstanding, that really no one else has replicated amazingly, especially on things like heroism and sense of life and literature and literature and so on. But I do have disagreements with her on many other grounds. But she inspired me in the sense that I felt her books, no one else had written books like hers, and I kind of felt that they were very valuable books, even for all their faults. And I think there's an age when you are young, where you're hungry for knowledge. You don't necessarily want to pick up the latest quarterly from the Royal Society for whatever. But you do want to know more about things, and literature is a great way to introduce it to the young mind. Give it a nice story in the background, and they'll swallow it whole. So yes, she was the kind of inspiration probably at the beginning, and I like the James Bond books, not more so than the films. I really like the James Bond books, and I felt I could do a James Bond, like every kid, I suppose. I did feel also that the Bond franchise was on its last legs. Even then in the 90s, you could tell that they were struggling, and that's definitely come to pass. So I felt that there would be a gap in the market if I married a sort of Ayn Rand stroke Ian Fleming type join them together at the hip. Anyway, I got to the age of 30, had the time, money and stuff to do it, so I set out. Now, I dedicated 5 years to it, I think, but it ended up being 10. Now, I didn't write solidly in that time. I traveled the world. I had a great time as well, but my main job in those 10 years was writing a book. And at the end of it, I got to a fairly satisfactory conclusion with it, and I presented it to loads of publishers and stuff in London, got rejected by all but one. But the one that I didn't get rejected by was the top guy at Orion Publishing, which is one of the big five. He was a young executive there who's since gone on to become top dog, as far as I can tell. And he accepted it. He loved it. He got me I didn't have to even get an agent. He just said to the agent, take this guy Nichols and let's go publish it. And then, like 2 weeks before we were meant to formalise the contract, he very sheep-facedly said, sorry, I've been told we can't publish this, politically incorrect. And this was about 2005, so you can almost date the beginning of the cancel culture to that moment, because it was pretty unusual in those days. I had half been expecting it, and it was dropped. Now, at that point, I'd basically run out of money, getting old. I needed to get my life back on track as well. So I dropped the book. I had, pushed it too far as it was, and I got married and so on, and left the book on the shelf for a long time. About 10 years probably, because it took me that long to get the rest of my life sort of back in gear. And then one day, I toyed with it a lot, and one day in about 2016, I saw an advert for the London e-publisher looking for new material. And it was the first time I'd resubmitted it, but I thought, well, it was good enough for Orion, maybe these guys will take it too. And they did, overnight. Now, two things: you didn't get paid much, you didn't get paid anything, just royalties, which were very slim. And two, they didn't put any time editing it or anything. They just, I don't think they even read it through, because there was so many typos at this stage in it and stuff, because I toyed with it for 10 years. But anyway, they published it, and I was finally a published author many years after starting, 20 years later. Lo and behold, about 2 years into that, I ran a Facebook group in Mexico called Non-Politically Correct Brits in Mexico or something, and some Englishman, lefty, got onto the group, took snapshots of every comment that he deemed irregular, which was just about all of them, because that's what the whole point of the group was. And although they weren't my comments, he sent them to the publisher and said, this guy is the admin of the group that uses words like this and that, and I was banned within an hour. They cancelled me within an hour, on no grounds whatsoever. They could have easily stood up for it. And I thought, well, I was disappointed, obviously, but actually I thought, thank God, because it's a mess. The book's a mess, and if I'm going to be published, I'd like to do it. Well, I look at it this way. We've been, as writers on the side of the fence, completely abandoned by the media in toto, let alone the publishing industry. And that has given us many weaknesses. We don't get much money, we don't get any publicity, we don't get the benefits of an editor, and we don't get the benefits of feedback, solid feedback from people who understand how a book should be. But the one advantage we have if we're self-publishing is that we can be our own boss. So I took the book back and I've rewritten it. Every now and then I'll open a chapter that I'm not happy in my brain, I'm playing around with it, and I'll rewrite the bits to the point where I'm done with it now. It's 100% finished, but I'm quite glad that I got cancelled that second time, because it gave me a chance to make it into the book it should have been back then. So yes, overall, 27 years almost to the day, I've been writing it, which is incredible to me, but not all of that time obviously dedicated to it. I have run businesses in between and done all sorts of other things, got married.
It's funny what you say about the publishing industry as well, because it doesn't feel like there are, any explicitly, even just mildly right-of-centre writers. But what is happening is that Gen X, like we said before, Gen X liberals are getting repackaged as sort of like right wing. So I think of people like Bret Easton Ellis, who's someone I always enjoyed, but is very much like a Californian left-wing Gen X liberal guy, and he's now being repackaged as untouchable. And
yeah.
Other people, like, I've not read his work, but Jonathan Franzen gets kind of packaged in the same way a little bit as well. And yeah, it's strange. It's strange. Not only is a certain segment of art creators being rejected, the people who are already in there are getting repackaged.
Yeah.
Strange.
No, the Overton window's shifted so much. I mean, it's spinning now. It's backwards. But yeah, we can only work with what we got, can't we? And I do feel that it will all change. This is cyclical. There is I started the Red Pill Fiction Factory maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and at that time there were literally a handful of people I could identify on Twitter, mainly, who qualified to be interviewed. But now, frankly, the new one pops up every week, and the quality is superlative. It's getting better all the time. So the writers are emerging, which is great. Now we just need the audience to recognise and have a connection with it, because the big problem, of course, is publicity and getting the message out. But slowly but surely, I think it'll be worth it. And
are you familiar with the Passages Prize?
Yes, and that's a very excellent example.
Yeah, every year there's writers who I've never heard of who are winning that contest, and you think, wow, just new people joining the scene all the time. But yeah, we've talked around a lot of the aspects of the book. It's obviously a spy thriller, an action adventure thriller, however you want to call it. But do you want to give a little summary of the plot before we get into some of the aspects of style and some of the things I really liked about its delivery?
Yeah, it starts in Mexico, in a hacienda. Funnily enough, that's where I live now. Life imitating art and all that. And a British operator, he's called, it starts in media res, I think is the special term, where you're deep in the action almost immediately. And he's obviously on a mission that's been blown, and he has to get a message back, which he succeeds in doing. And then we go into a short period where a chapter where you see how the British establishment react to this guy's plight. And they basically want to hush it up and leave it at arm's length and pretend it never happened. But one guy persists, and he has a connection, and sooner or later, Buchan is called into action. Buchan is he's a heavy-hitting, sort of sour, but he has his moments of humour and stuff. But overall, he's a brute. He's a force of nature. He's not I wanted to distinguish very much from the James Bond in that respect. I feel James Bond is great fun and stuff, but all this about martinis and tuxedos and Aston Martins it's been done, and you can't really repeat it without making it look like a parody. But B, if you ever look at the people who actually get the awards for doing this kind of thing, they are not James Bond-like. They are much more rugged and tough and You know, they're likely to have eaten food from a can of dog food lately rather than a sort of filet mignon in Paris. But you know, that's the nature of the world, isn't it? It's, you know, anyway. So I wanted it. He's like that, and he gets sent to Mexico to find out what happened and to take any further measures that are necessary, which is what he does through the course of the book. And it transpires that it's a group of terrorists allied with each other to complete a mission that involves a hurricane. And during the course of it, he does get to meet a lovely lady, and that makes up somewhat for the death of a former girlfriend by the same sort of IRA group and terrorist organisation that killed her. So it's the classic odyssey of a man challenged beyond his means, but somehow still manages to stay sane and alive and achieve his goals and bed the girl in the process, and with a happy ending, hopefully. So yeah, that's the long and short of the plot.
You very much pay homage to Bond and, you know, other spy and thriller books, but without falling into cliche, which was something that I was very impressed with. Even so far as we talk about Carrie, who's the second woman in his life, and I can't remember the name of the first woman. What's her name?
Vicky is the first, yeah.
Yes, and neither of those is exactly a damsel in distress. Both women are actually it's just occurred to me now, they're actually very strong and particularly modern women in a way. It just in terms of kind of their abilities, like they're both hardly like shrinking violets.
Well, I think a man like Buchan would not be attracted to someone who was too much of a shrinking violet. I think he would like modesty and a demure personality rather than extra, you know, someone who's shooting vodkas all night, stripping on the countertop. But yes, I like. What I've tried to do is present a role models, if you like, for the feminine and the male in the book. The modern male and the modern female have undergone terrible experimentation at the hands of the bad people in our society, it seems to me, so that neither knows which way is up or down, and they're all confused, and the results are shockingly apparent already, and I dread to think what will happen after 2 or 3 generations of this, if indeed we have generations to follow, because now they've even given up on sex, and you know, and it's all just gone horribly wrong. So I wanted to, part of the book is a sort of instruction manual, believe it or not, well hopefully it is, how to behave, how to dress, how to talk to people, how to present, you know, have courage and confidence in yourself, because I think literature is an excellent medium for that, much more so than a sort of Debrett's guide on how to behave or something. For the young, they're never going to study stuff in detail, but role models have always played a role, you know, their role in development of humans, and unfortunately we've neglected it to a horrific extent. Results that are all too graphically, you know, visible.
I guess what I felt in summary was that you'd presented 2 very feminine characters. They're both very different as well, so it's not like Carrie was just a replacement. But they are feminine. You haven't just kind of returned to some sort of milkmaid in some sort of cliche way. They're very feminine in the modern world. They're very modern. I thought that was.
Well, hopefully, because I am writing very much my target audience. I decided early on was the young, primarily British male, but the young in general. So the young. I mean, I love it to go international and stuff. I think a lot of it is very British oriented, so I'm not sure how far it can travel. But for male and female, you know, I do want it to have some appeal, and it's the modern young, and you've got to work with them. There's no other generation that you can snatch from an alternate universe. So we have to work with the material we've got, which is a theme that comes up in the book a lot as well. And yeah, however challenging it might be, and God knows we've got our work cut out, they are the targets.
In terms of style, I thought you'd done a really good job of, it just flows very smoothly, and there's not a kind of overt or in-your-face style in any way. And it gets out of the way of the plot, and the plot and the action and the characters and what they do and the character arcs just carry it. Although there are moments like the one I gave before about, you know, when you do land those like beautiful descriptive moments now and again, they really land because most of the way the style is just getting out of the way of the plot and letting the reader just glide along. And it feels very smooth and very accomplished. And how difficult was that to achieve?
Very difficult. I started taking notes when I was a teenager with the thought of just ideas, really. And I used to carry a little notebook around with me from the age of about 17 or 18 onwards. And never really stopped until I got a computer and started using that instead. Because there are so many incidents and moments in life which are perfect for the moment, but if you don't make a note of them, they'll be long gone by the time you're writing your book and need to recall them. So a lot of those little intricate details would have been picked up by me maybe 15 years earlier in a bar in Japan or something like that. But I was I don't enjoy a lot of modern books where it's all dialogue. The chapter will start, they met in a bar, 8, and then the dialogue starts, and you don't know anything about the bar, you don't know anything about the street, the context, the people in the bar. And older books were much more descriptive in that sense. Maybe half or more of the book is descriptive, and I don't know. It's just a personal preference. So I wanted it to be. People are calling it filmic because you sort of see all the details. There's tons of detail come through in any scene that I try and write. I put it down to probably Fleming is an influence in that respect, Ayn Rand, but also people like Frederick Forsyth, Alistair MacLean, the sort of classic 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s thrillers, were much more descriptive. And if I'm going to get people to spend like 16 hours or whatever reading a book about being in Mexico, I want them at least to come away at the end of it understanding a little bit more about Mexico, or the scenery would have been like, or the jungle, or the vegetation, or something. The difficult part is to integrate it in a way, like you say, that it sort of runs together and isn't just endless blobs of detail for no apparent reason. I always try and meld it somehow so that it goes with the story of the plot.
I actually wanted to touch on those descriptive and travelogue kind of aspects of it, because it did remind me a lot of Ian Fleming. And I read once that part of the appeal of Fleming's work was that people who didn't have access, when Fleming's work came out, to like holidays abroad, or even things as simple as like sparkling wine, wearing a tuxedo and a dress shirt. Yeah. And that's partly why Bond was this kind of more suave, sophisticated traveler of the world, because Fleming describes these things so richly because people are living vicariously through him. And that's something I really enjoyed, and it was a real thrill to read that again. The descriptions of Ypres, is that how you say it? Ypres.
Ypres is correct, yeah.
Ypres and Yucatan and the haciendas, and some of the ways you described Mexico, I felt like I was sweltering. It was fantastic.
Good.
So I
think it's a laziness that's overtaken a lot of writers, and they get paid handsomely. I mean, these are top 10 New York bestsellers writers all the time, but the industry doesn't pay them. As long as they don't write anything that's politically incorrect, they'll shoo them through the system. And yes, a lot of it's done by not even by the original writer. He's got a team of writers now, and it's almost, this AI thing could take over and do a much better job than a lot of them, because it is just dialogue and very little else, a bit of a plot twist here or there. And yeah, it's a shame. I think you should come away with a lot more than just an enjoyable ride from a book. Well, instead of my book, it should be informative and instructive in your own life somehow.
Yes, and one other element that stood out to me as well is that despite, I mean, some of the action scenes are excellent, and you had, I forget the guy's name, the guy who wrote Hot Dose of Hell. You had him on a couple of weeks
Steve
ago.
Stark.
Yes.
Yes.
And you praised his kind of action sequences, but reading Lost Causes, I thought your action sequences were very well composed, and they carry on and they ratchet up the tension, which is what you'd expect in this genre. But there's also a lot of warmth, and one of the scenes that touched me in particular is when John Buchan is picking his name. That was a heart-wrenching scene. I don't know if
thanks. That was one of the recent ones that I added. It literally took 25, 26 years for it to evolve in my brain. First of all, the action scenes, I found them very hard to write. I found it too chaotic, and they needed a lot of work. I mean, I must have spent years on some of them, and I'm still not totally satisfied. But I didn't want it to be, what I didn't, I hate, going back to modern literature a lot, it's just like a Jason Bourne film. It's a wham, bam, wham, bam, wham, bam, wham, bam, and then you wham him one more time and you win. And I didn't want it to be just all about this punch and that block and that, you know, whatever. So I wanted to add something to those scenes. But it's very difficult to do and be original and and carry the sort of thriller element as well. But yes, I found them very challenging. I think when I get round to the next book, I will have a much better chance at doing it right.
Just a final bit on the plotting is just, I was very impressed with how you planted a lot of things. The plotting's excellent. It's very thorough, and details that I thought were perhaps incidental when I was early in the book come back to then become very important, not least the main character's medical condition, which was an astonishing twist. That was fantastic. But just, I thought we're approaching an hour now, so I thought maybe before we close off and you can tell listeners and viewers like how to find you and what future work you've got, I just wanted to mention that as I got to the end, it became apparent, and perhaps this is the Randian influence, is that one of the things you seem to, that really reminded me of Atlas Shrugged was the good guys are naive. So they think they're just normal, and they don't think that other people think differently. So he struggles to kind of, when the villain spells out his motivations, he struggles to understand it. And that's the first time he thinks, oh, I've got different motivations. I've got a different way of seeing the world. And it reminded me of the way Dagny and Reardon in Atlas Shrugged are kind of naive until Francisco and John Gall explain it to them. They're naive that they have a different outlook.
Yeah. Well, that's an excellent insight by you. I've forgotten the original. I mean, I read and reread Atlas Shrugged, but the last time was 20 or 30 years ago, so I don't remember it. But I know what you're talking about, but I don't remember that specific sort of development in their knowledge. But yes, I wanted very much Buchan. Buchan is a big brute, but like a lot of big brutes, he's quite simple, you know, in his tastes, and simple in his. He doesn't spend ages reading the Nicomachean Ethics or Nietzsche or anything like that. He sees the world and calls it as it is. There's nothing wrong with that, but he is vulnerable in that he's naive and he's got high trust. And it's very important, these aspects of his character, because he represents us. In that sense, the Western man, not all of us, but a huge percentage of us, our biggest weakness, our Achilles heel, without any question, is that we become complacent and we've taken too much. We trust people, anybody, the way we would trust our parents or our best friend. You know, there's tons of it that's it's becoming very apparent through social media, these YouTube videos and stuff, where we jump in a river to save a puppy dog and stuff like that. It's quite a unique attribute, but it makes us very vulnerable, and we cannot see that people would do otherwise. I think I use the word to the pure all things are pure, which isn't mine. It comes from I think a Scottish poet called Muir, who I could never find the quote in the internet, but think I tried. But it sums it up. To us, to pure people, to people who have a pure outlook, that's it. You know, the world is the way, it's like a child. They can't see the obscene dimension, say, to some aspects of modern life. It's just like teddy bears and cuddly toys and stuff. Yeah, but that's very important. It's very important we get to grips with this. It's not a sort of minor aspect of the novel. I'm trying to show people that we are in this predicament largely of our own making. It can be stopped in an instant the moment we realize this. Because if something's going wrong because you're doing it, well, the moment you stop doing it, it's going to start getting better, isn't it? Yeah, so it's all about that. Funnily, our ancestors were much better at this. They were very much able to combine the high trust and the high, pure vision with a much more ruthless approach to those who lived otherwise and threatened their existence. And it's something we've got to examine.
So, yeah, let's end on a more hopeful note, and let's ask, how can people find you in this excellent book, and what's next?
Right. Well, I don't have many outlets. I don't have a website or anything. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Facebook, but I hardly use it. So Twitter's definitely the place, at writer_Nichols. And the book obviously is on Amazon for now. God knows how long that will last. But yeah, beyond that, there's not much really. I don't want to become too much of one of these sort of writers that does Substack and does everything else. I think that books to do speak for me rather than the tons of essays and stuff. And I dedicate my time to those. The next project, well, the first project, as you'll be well aware now, deals with the deterioration of modern society, Western society, and one of the sources of that deterioration. And my first book addresses a sort of aspect which is very overlooked, that I felt was the more important. There are two main. The threat to Western society comes from two different sort of entities. The famous one that everyone's familiar with now is the elites. And I basically ignored them in the first book to choose the second one, which is who do the elites use? They're very limited in number. I mean, there may even be 300 of them, or 10,000 at the most, or maybe 1 million, but that's nothing in the scheme of things when you've got countries like America with 300 million alone and so on. So they need to work with lots and lots of other people to get their goals achieved. And the first book is, who do they work with? Who are these people amongst us that are collaborators, if you want, or quislings, whatever term you want to use. And I'm quite satisfied I've dealt with that issue now. But the second one, obviously, would be, it's like the jaw, two sets of teeth in a mouth. You can do a lot more damage with the bottom and the top coordinating to chew up what's ever in the middle, rather than just one set sort of squashing the victims. So the second story will be about the upper set of jaws, or teeth, which will be the elites. But I'm hoping to come at it from a very unique way, not just the bit boring sort of, the classic sort of almost James Bondian baddie who's just super rich. Yeah, I think, well, that comes into what I'm going to do, but I think, well, you'll have to wait and see, but the Spectre comes into it. But yes, I'm coming at it from a slightly different direction, because I have to say, of what I've learned in the course of the nearly 3 decades that I've been studying this phenomenon. I think there's a lot more to them, and it's a lot more convoluted, and it's very different to how we think of them, and I want to explain that somewhat. But I'm a very slow writer. If I take as long to write the next book as I took to write this one, I'll be in my 90s, I think. So don't hold your breath, but I am working on it, and I do hope to, I will, now that I've got the first one completely out of the way, I'll dedicating myself to it. It will also explore a lot more of Buchan's background in Rhodesia. I think the Rhodesia story and what went on is a very important one to understand in terms of what's going on today. I think to a large extent Rhodesia was a prototype for what we're suffering.
It's clear that obviously ideas and politics and all these things downstream from it, upstream from it rather, culture, etc., are important to you. And we've spoken a lot about that today. But I think it's important that, like, the listeners and the viewers, the people who might buy this book, I have to stress again, it doesn't come across as overtly political. The characters, some of the characters hold these ideas, some of the characters hold different ideas, and it just comes out through the action. It's not like Atlas Shrugged or the Fountainhead with people lecturing. So, yeah, although the ideas are important, if this is I've already recommended this to a lot of male friends who don't read much fiction, because I'm like, if you want to get back into reading fiction, this is the gateway drug.
Oh, well, that's exactly why I wrote it. I deeply appreciate hearing that. Unfortunately, since I started writing, book reading by males has fallen off a cliff, not largely because the publishing industry hates them and doesn't want them to read anything but pap, feminized pap at that. But obviously, it's a source of great pleasure. It's a great source of education for a lot of us. And I specifically wrote it for a young, mainly British male population audience, in the hope that they will, benefit, enjoy it, and so on, but get to grips with some of the existential threats which they face today, more so them than us, because I'm getting old anyway. But that's terrific to hear, and that's exactly why I wrote it. And if that's true, then that's very satisfying to hear.
Well, all that's left to say, Richard, is thank you for coming on your show. So
it's a great pleasure to be on my show. It wasn't bad as I thought, thank goodness. And I think you did an outstanding job, and I deeply appreciate it. And hopefully we'll get you back to do other shows. You never know if you're up to it. How was it for you?
It was, you're still recording in case you want to cut this bit off. It was, fine. I feel more comfortable on this side. Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks, Clark. I'm really delighted, and this will be up in a few days, and I appreciate it, and be in touch.
Thank you.